Hi there, history fans. So today we have a patron suggestion, and the video is called The History of Coffee from a channel called Cogito. The patron noticed that I'm a huge coffee fan, so he recommended this video. It's approximately 18 minutes long, and I'm really interested in how this guy, Cogito, this is the first time I'm covering his videos, or one of his videos. So I'm interested what he's going to mention and what not, if he's going to mention the French Revolution, Haiti, and so on. But yeah, as always, the link to the original video is going to be in the description below. Give them a view and a like. Any additional information, corrections on my part or on the video's part, let me know in the comment section below. I will appreciate it, because we're all here to learn something new. And I have something new. I put the mic here just to test if the volume or the audio is going to be better or worse. Okay, let's jump into the video.
This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get access
grab your
to
coffee,
my streaming video service,
tea,
Nebula, when you sign
or
up
if
for
you're Czech,
CuriosityStream using the link
grab
in
your
the
beer.
description.
Czech people will understand. Best part of the day, the morning, just drinking coffee.
Would life be possible without coffee? Would our modern society
No.
cease to function if we could no longer drink our dark, piping hot caffeine elixir? Well, the history of coffee is a fascinating one connected to mystical Muslim Sufis, French revolutionaries, slaves, soldiers, constipation, and alcohol-soaked toddlers. So, what is the history of coffee? Well, let's find out.
So he's going to mention the French Revolution, okay.
Our story begins in a dark, scary period of human history, the pre-Cafazine. The ancient land of Ethiopia may be the cradle of all humankind, but more importantly, it is the birthplace of coffee. Here in the mountainous rainforest near Kaffa, coffee has grown wild.
Thank you, Ethiopia. Thank you. All put down an E in the comment section for Ethiopia. Everybody should know that coffee comes from Ethiopia. Thank you, Ethiopia.
For millennia.
You're the best.
We don't exactly know when humans first started consuming coffee, but the most popular story involves some very happy goats. One afternoon, an Ethiopian goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats hopping about excitedly. Some were even dancing. He saw the goats eating leaves and berries from a small shrub. Kaldi, now curious, decided to eat some himself. Soon his heart was pounding, his mind was racing, and he was dancing with his goats. The magical, energetic properties of caffeine had been discovered. Now, this is just a story. Kaldi probably wasn't the first coffee addict. The world's first coffee lovers were probably the Oromo people. They've probably been chewing on coffee beans and leaves for thousands of years. They would crush it up and mix it with fat to make ancient coffee power bars. Coffee leapt across the Red Sea with Oromo slaves. Sometimes,
as far as I know, coffeine, don't take me on my word, I'm not a chemist or something like that, but as far as I know, coffeine is kind of a toxin or something like that, because the plant evolved or made caffeine because it's toxical for smaller bodies, so for the insects that would chop on the leaves and so on, and then they would come to the coffee beans, they would try to eat it, and then they will fall dead. But because humans have a larger body than insects and also animals, like the small portions of coffee that we drink, they don't have a big negative effect on our bodies. But for insects, caffeine, as far as I know, is deadly.
Time in the mid-15th century to the port city of Mocha in modern-day Yemen. There, the Sufi mystics found that the drink could keep them awake during their long nighttime prayers. It was in Yemen that coffee made from roasted beans is first documented. The most popular species of coffee was born here, Coffea arabica, which now makes up about 60% of the world coffee supply. They named the drink kawa, the Arabic word for wine, from which the word coffee probably comes from.
Because on the Balkans, in Croatian, we also say kava. Kava. And, it depends in which region of Southeastern Europe, the Balkans, whatever you want to call it. But some nations call it kafa or kava. It's interesting. All the language thinks how while the Ottomans, like conquered regions of Europe, and then the language took some Arabic words and Ottoman words into the Balkan nation vocabulary. It's interesting.
By the end
always.
of the 15th century, coffee had spread throughout the Islamic world, and the cafe was soon born. Cafes found a niche in Islamic society. Devout Muslims can't really just head down to the pub. So, cafes provided the Islamic world with a secular social space outside the home, where Muslim men could engage in lively conversation about politics, business, and religion. Coffee soon became so important that in Turkey, the inability to provide coffee beans was grounds for divorce. But some rulers thought people were having a bit too much fun at the cafes. Now, their actual concern was that people were discussing politics and informing
Men, bring me my coffee.
themselves, which rulers tend not to like. Coffee would find itself banned in Mecca and Constantinople for a time during the 15 and 1600s. But coffee drinking continued in secret until the bans were lifted. While Muslims were sipping away in their fancy cafes, to the west of them lay a small, divided and violent backwater called Europe. Since coffee and tea hadn't reached Europe yet, and the drinking water was sometimes unsafe, beer was Europe's favorite beverage. A professor of medicine in
It's still the favorite beverage in the Czech Republic. Czechs will understand.
1551 stated, people subsist more on this drink than they do on food. On average, every man, woman and child in England drank over 350 litres of beer per year up to the 17th century, while Germans were putting away 400 to 600 litres. Europe wobbled about under this depressive and confusing alcoholic haze, until Dutch, Venetians and Italian merchants began importing coffee in the 17th century, and a new, stimulating social space opened up.
Okay, just first a question. For your region where you come from, or your country, whatever, I would like to know if your country is either a tea country or a coffee country, or region, whatever. And beer was prevalent, but like people still drank water more than beer. It's actually a myth that people would prefer beer to water. Interesting thing, look it up. The so-called in German Reinheitsgebot from 1516. It was practically the first law on food regulation in the German states, Reinheitsgebot, how beer should be made. It's interesting. But yeah.
Oddly enough, it was firstly in England that cafe culture captivated Europeans. London's first cafe opened in 1652. By 1700, there were over 2,000 cafes in London.
And I mean, if you look the number, what did he say? Like 350 liters a year per person. It's like approximately 1 liter a day. I mean, yeah. Czechs will understand.
Called penny universities because for the price of a cup of coffee, you could sit there and listen to the country's most intelligent people chat. You see, pubs were not the safest places to discuss politics or religion. People were drunk or armed, usually drunk and armed, whereas cafes provided a sober and caffeine-enhanced environment for debate and discussion, which was exactly why King Charles II tried to ban them in 1675, before quickly being forced to back down. English cafes would foster early capitalism. Some of the world's largest businesses, like Lloyd's of London, the East India Company, and the London Stock Exchange, all began as cafes. Now,
what? I really didn't know that. What, the East Indian Company started as a coffee with a coffee place? What? That's amazing.
Everyone loved coffee, though, especially women who were excluded from cafes. In 1674, they complained. We find of late a very sensible decay of the true old English vigour, our gallants being every way so Frenchified. We can attribute to nothing more than the excessive use of that newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee, which has so eunuched our husbands, and spend their money all for a little base, black, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking, nauseous puddle water. We humbly pray that henceforth the drinking coffee may on severe penalties be forbidden, and instead thereof lusty nappy beer and cock ale be recommended to general use. Cock ale, by the way, is beer with a dead rooster in it. The link to their full 6-page complaint is linked below, and I highly recommend you go read it for a good laugh. By 1777, coffee was so popular in Prussia that Friedrich the Great complained, "My people must drink beer. His Majesty was brought up on beer, and so were his ancestors." In 1781, he banned citizens roasting coffee and created a secret anti-coffee police force nicknamed Coffee Smellers to sniff out illegal coffee dealers. But like elsewhere, the bans were soon reversed. The Viennese soon became Europe's next big coffee lovers. Their great idea was adding sugar and milk to coffee, creating the cappuccino, named after the colour of a Capuchin monk's robe, which became known in Italian as a cappuccino.
Cappuccino,
in 1669, a Turkish ambassador introduced Paris.
The interesting thing is, it is said that after the siege of Vienna in 1683, you know, like where Jan Sobieski came and saved the city with his winged hussars and so on, when they saved the city from the Ottomans, that, you know, like they ran over the Ottomans didn't even have the chance to retreat with their what is it called, tents, where, you know, like they sleep overnight and so on. So a lot of the coffee was left over, and then the Viennese took the coffee, brought it into the city, but because of the flavor of the coffee, they didn't like it, and then eventually they would put in milk and sugar to make a better taste, and that's, you know, like the Austrian or the Viennese coffee. So coffee with milk, cappuccino, cappucciner. Yeah, but yeah. If you drink coffee, do you drink it with milk or without milk? With sugar or without sugar? I drink it always with milk and without sugar. But the interesting thing, most of the Austrians that I know, they don't drink coffee with milk. They drink it pure.
To coffee.
Black coffee.
The French originally didn't like the taste, but no matter how much they disliked the stuff, they were deeply moved by its unique ability to deeply move them. Or, in the words of Paludanus, to breaketh wind and openeth any stopping. Soon French doctors were prescribing coffee enemas. Now, the bowels weren't the only thing coffee was stimulating in France. It also tickled the mind. Soon after the 1689 opening of the stylish Café Procope, it attracted the likes of Diderot, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Benjamin Franklin. Soon, thousands of Parisian cafes were fueling the Enlightenment. On July 12, 1789, Camille Desmoulins delivered a passionate speech from a cafe table and whipped the crowd up into an anti-aristocracy rage. 2 days later, they stormed the Bastille, igniting the French Revolution. Over in British North America, Washington, Hamilton...
That's true, and because of that, because in a coffee place you would sit there for hours and talk about different stuff and so on, a lot of the European governments, I know it from the Habsburg monarchy, check it for your country, if you're from Europe or wherever you are. There were also secret police undercover police that would go into the coffee places and see if there's, you know, like a anti-regime sentiment in different coffee places and so on. So the governments in Europe were pretty scared of coffee places. Let's say it that way.
Stormed the Bastille.
So that's true. That's true.
Over in British North America, Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson used cafes as the headquarters of the American Revolution. The now caffeine-addicted Europeans were desperate to find coffee supplies not controlled by the Ottoman Turks. In the mid-17th century, the Dutch brought coffee from India to grow in Ceylon, Java, Sumatra, and across Southeast Asia. Dutch colonists would drown Europe in Asian coffee using enslaved natives. In 1860, Dutch civil servant Edward Douws Dekker quit in disgust and wrote the novel Max Havelaar, which documented the terror taking place on Java and attacked Dutch landowners who grew rich from the poverty of others. In 1720, Gabriel Mathieu de Clieu brought a coffee plant to the colony of Martinique during a harrowing journey where his ship was attacked by pirates, storms, and dehydration. During the trip, he shared his daily ration of half a cup of water with the tiny coffee plant. His sacrifice paid off. Within 50 years...
I can understand him.
years, there were 18 million coffee trees on the island. The offspring of his plant are now responsible for a huge part of the world's coffee supply. William Muckers wrote about coffee, wherever it has been introduced, it has spelled revolution. It has been the world's most radical drink in that its function has always been to make people think, and when the people begin to think, they become dangerous to tyrants. The irony was that while coffee was seen as helping to free Europe and the US from tyrants, it brought tyranny elsewhere. The Clue almost sacrificed his life for his tiny coffee plant, but he never actually thought of harvesting it himself. Slaves from Africa would do that. By the 1780s, 60% of all the coffee consumed in Europe came from the tiny French colony of Saint-Domingue, harvested by over 500,000 African slaves. So the coffee that nourished Voltaire and the Enlightenment involved the most barbaric form of forced labour. J.H.B. de Saint-Pierre noted while travelling in the Caribbean in 1773, "I do not know if coffee and sugar are essential to the happiness of Europe, but I know well that these two products have accounted for the unhappiness of two great regions of the world. America has been depopulated so as to have land on which to plant them, and Africa has been depopulated so as to have the people to cultivate them." The 1789 French Revolution inspired the slaves in Saint-Domingue to rebel and demand their own freedom, creating the slave-free nation of Haiti in 1804. But when it comes...
Yeah, maybe the most famous slave revolt that was successful. But yeah, Brazil is an interesting story, because Brazil was practically built on coffee, but like they needed to cut down the Amazon parts of the Amazon forest to make plantations for them and so on. But Brazil had one of the biggest numbers on slaves that were sent from Africa there. And in 1 year, I think it was the 60s, correct me, check it out, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was in the 60s, the price of coffee plunged so hard because Brazil was producing so much coffee that eventually they needed to drop, tons and tons of coffee just into the ocean to put up the price of coffee back again, up.
To the quantity
crazy
of
story,
slaves, though,
Brazil and coffee,
takes
crazy
the
story.
Awful cake. Just in the first half of the 19th century, 1.5 million African slaves were shipped here to work on coffee plantations known as latifundia, which made coffee men some of the wealthiest in Brazil. This led to Brazil keeping slavery longer than any other nation in the Western Hemisphere. It only outlawed it in 1888. Brazil conquered the coffee world. It produced such an extraordinary amount that it helped increase demand by making coffee cheap enough for members of North America and Europe's working class. Brazil democratized coffee through slavery. By the 1920s, Brazil was producing 80% of the world's coffee. It's been the world's leading coffee producer for over 150 years, and in 2017, it produced 2.5 million tons. That's a third of the global coffee supply. Coffee made modern Brazil, but at an enormous cost. Brazil was, according to Eduardo Galeano, ruined by a plant whose destructive form of cultivation left forests razed, natural reserves exhausted, and general decadence in its wake. As Brazil conquered...
And as far as I know, just imagine, coffee plants. And the interesting thing about coffee beans is that they aren't ready to harvest in the same period. So, you cannot say, okay, today it's, I don't know in which month they harvest it, but I don't know, December, whatever, it's December. In this month, we're going to harvest all the coffee beans that we have in this field. But you need to go to the specific plant, see which seeds are, I think, red, and then every single one seed you need to put down with the hands. So it was a back-breaking job where you weren't allowed to break, the green ones who weren't finished yet and so on. And imagine just doing it out in the open and then, you being a slave in the coffee business industry. I mean, it was crazy.
The coffee world, Central America followed in its footsteps. The history of Guatemala is an example of what happened to the entire region. After gaining independence from Spain, the government turned to coffee cultivation as a potential source of wealth. Prime coffee growing lands were, however, occupied by indigenous peoples such as the Maya. This land was then confiscated by rich coffee growers. Then indigenous peoples were forced to work on the new massive coffee plantations. They were watched over by an enormous army. Jeffrey Page wrote in Coffee and Power, Guatemala had so many soldiers that it resembled a penal colony because it was a penal colony based on forced labor. This system dominated Central America. The only local exception was Costa Rica. You see, most of Costa Rica's indigenous peoples had been killed off centuries before by Spanish settlers and disease. So when Costa Ricans began growing coffee in the 1830s, they couldn't run those large slave plantations like Brazil and Guatemala. Now, they still enslaved some, but there just weren't that many. Instead, small farming families working together did the physical labor. By not relying on slave labor, Costa Rica was able to develop into a more united and stable nation. In 1906, while in Guatemala, George Washington, an oddly named Belgian, mixed refined coffee crystals with water to brew coffee instantly. Now, he wasn't the first to invent instant coffee, but he was the first to mass produce it. His invention came just in time for the First World War and its massive demand for instant coffees. In 1918, the US Army bought the entire George Washington instant coffee output. By the time the war ended, the US Army was preparing over 40 million cups of coffee daily. So let's head back.
Yeah, and I think that the coffee called Americana, is actually from that time period, when the American Army bought the company.
Asia for a bit. In 1869, an outbreak of leaf rust caused by the fungus Hamilia vastrix began. It first appeared in British-controlled Ceylon and wiped out all of their coffee Arabica plants, along with India's, Java's, Sumatras, and the rest of Southeast Asia's. Many had to switch to growing tea, and turned Britain into a tea-drinking nation. This started a panicked search for other species of coffee. Enter Coffea canephora, better known as Robusta. Native to Central Africa and discovered just as the fungus ruined Asian crops. It turned out to be disease-resistant, twice as caffeinated as Arabica, and grew essentially anywhere in the coffee belt. Its only disadvantage was that Robusta beans, well, they taste like arse. They need to be blended with some Arabica to be drinkable. Then in 1938, Nestlé launched Nescafé, a new and improved powdered instant coffee, and took over the global instant coffee market. The taste of instant coffee was so bad that it didn't really matter if you used cheap Robusta beans, leading to a cheap instant coffee industry boom in the post-World War II period. Today, Robusta makes up about 40% of global coffee production. Competing with instant coffees were the Italians. In 1884, Angelo invented the first espresso machine, which was then improved upon in 1901 by Luigi Bezzera. This new espresso was made by forcing almost boiling water under high pressure through very fine coffee grounds. Before this, coffee would take up to 5 minutes to brew. Espresso cut this down to 30 seconds and produced a much more consistent cup. By the 1930s, espresso was in cafes all over Europe and the United States. The speed of espresso and espresso-made drinks made it the ideal beverage to grab before work and during newly invented coffee breaks. It became the perfect drug to fuel the rise of capitalism. Now,
and as far as I know, because, like the espresso was Italian, all the different, types of tea, like Americana, whatever, blah, 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 espresso and so on. That's why they, or cappuccino and so on, they all have Italian names. Although they maybe originate from, other countries like the Cappucciner from Austria.
Much of the world orders their coffee in Italian. Espresso, cappuccino, latte, macchiato. Sure, even the Americano, a drink invented for American soldiers, is ordered in Italian. All remnants of Italy's Espresso Revolution.
Yeah.
Except Frappuccino. That's not a word. That's nonsense. The Espresso Revolution soon moved into the home and fueled the creation of dozens of espresso-spurting household appliances. Within the coffee industry up until now, all the focus had been on creating the perfect or cheapest cup. But the beans that produced people's lattes were harvested by near-starving peasants. So, Fairtrade International began in 1997 to try and guarantee a certain fair standard for products such as coffee. To be labelled fair trade, the production chain must follow fair trade standards. such as workers', environmental, and children's rights, along with the payment of the fair trade minimum price. Fair trade coffee sales have soared since its launch.
And as far as I know, children were used in a way that, you know, like the the grown-ups would collect the coffee beans that are, you know, like on their height, where they didn't need to bend over, and the children would work underneath them. And then they would go to another plant, and then the adults would do that, and the children underneath them, and so on. So it would be faster. But yeah.
Trade minimum price. Fair trade coffee sales have soared since its launch, but it has garnered its fair share of critics. It's not a perfect system, but it has done much to improve some lives and working conditions. Caffeine is now the world's most popular drug, and coffee is its most popular agent. We now brew about 1.4 billion cups of coffee every day. From a mystical Muslim drink, to colonial commodity, to revolutionary beverage, and the fuel of capitalism, this small African bean has transformed our world. Coffee is one of the many foods that has changed human history. If you'd like to know more about how food has transformed our world, I'd recommend you check out the History of Food over on CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a documentary streaming service that gives you access to thousands of documentaries.
Nice segue. I'm just gonna put it a little bit, the volume down, but I'm gonna let the Cogito subscribe. Okay, I don't know if he's a history channel or if he does, you know, like educational stuff in general, but I like his style. The interesting thing is, as I said, please answer it if your nation or region is a coffee nation or region or a tea, whatever. Czechs are a beer nation, so we all know that. I'm sorry, Czechs, but I love you. I love you. You gave us our parts of our alphabet, the Croatian one. Okay, so I hope that you enjoyed it. As always, the link to the original video is going to be in the description below. Give them a view and a like. Check out the other content of Cogito, the creator. And if you like his content, please subscribe to him. If you want to subscribe to this channel, please do it. I would like to have you to be part of our community. If you want to be a patron member, the link is going to be in the description below. All the money that is donated via Patreon or whatever I make, whatever little I make with YouTube videos is also going to be invested in gears, cameras, microphones, and so on. I'm planning actually to order, you know, like a standing mic or whatever, so that the quality of the volume is better and not to use this small one in the future. But yeah, everything that you need to know is in the link below, and I would like to hear your opinions, thoughts, corrections, and so on, because we're all here to learn something new. And until the next video, see ya!